In a river town in southern China, more than 1,000 years ago, a tax official opens a ledger and marks a family as unable to pay. The debt is not in coins, it is in grain, and because they cannot deliver enough of it, the sons of that household will be marched away to serve in an army they never chose, to die on a frontier they will never see the point of. A single measure of white grain has just decided who in that house lives free and who does not. They are not being punished for a crime, they are being punished for a bad harvest. That is the thing about the food on your plate tonight. Rice looks like the most innocent object in the world, small, pale, silent. It asks for nothing. It has no smell until you cook it, no flavor to boast about, no danger you can taste. And yet no single plant on earth has quietly ordered more human beings around than this one. It has raised emperors and starved provinces. It has been money, wages, weapon, and chain. It has moved more people against their will than almost any cargo in history. But the story of rice does not begin in that tax office. It begins thousands of years earlier, in the mud, with people whose names we lost long before anyone thought to write them down. You have to understand what a wild rice plant actually is, because it is almost useless to you. In its natural state, rice is a marshweed. It grows scattered along the edges of swamps and slow rivers, and it does something maddening. When the seeds ripen, the plant shatters. It flings its grain into the water and the mud so the next generation can sprout. That is brilliant survival for a plant. It is a catastrophe for a hungry human, because by the time you wait out to gather it, most of the food is already scattered into the swamp. You cannot store a swamp. You cannot ration a swamp. You cannot build a kingdom on a plant that throws its own harvest away. Somewhere along the Yangtze River Valley, more than 9,000 years ago, people began to fix that, slowly, over centuries. They noticed that a few freak plants held onto their grain a little longer instead of shattering, and those were the ones easiest to gather. So, those were the ones whose seed came home and went back into the ground. Generation after generation, they selected for the mutants that refused to let go. They were rewriting the plant. They had no genetics, no word for domestication, no theory of what they were doing. But they were doing it anyway, reaching into the machinery of a living thing and turning a swamp weed into a crop that would wait for the harvester. Think about the patience buried in that. Nobody who started the work lived to see it finished. This was a gift assembled by hundreds of years of anonymous hands, each generation handing the next a slightly better seed. By the time it was done, they had made something wild into something obedient. And obedience in a plant is the beginning of civilization, because a plant that keeps its grain is a plant you can measure, and a plant you can measure is a plant you can tax. Now here's the reversal, the part that undoes what you assume. We think of rice as generous, the humble food of the poor, the thing that stretches to feed everyone. For most of its history, it was closer to the opposite. Rice was one of the most demanding, most tyrannical crops a society could commit to. Wheat you can scatter on a dry field and mostly walk away. Rice, the wet kind that feeds billions, does not allow that. It wants to stand in water. It wants flooded fields, held at exactly the right depth, drained at exactly the right moment, for months. To give it what it wants, you have to reshape the earth itself. You have to build the paddy, a field walled to hold water like a shallow pond. You have to carve terraces into hillsides so the mountain becomes a staircase of mirrors. You have to dig canals, raise dikes, and coordinate water across whole valleys, because the field upstream and the field downstream are drinking from the same river. And if one man floods greedily, another man's crop dies. Rice does not permit you to farm alone. It forces you to organize. It forces you to cooperate, or to be ruled. And that is the secret the plant is hiding under all that innocence. Wherever wet rice took hold, it pulled human beings into dense, disciplined, tightly governed societies. Because you cannot run a paddy system with everyone doing as they please. Somebody has to decide who gets water and when. Somebody has to count the harvest. Somebody has to keep the ledger. The grain built the bureaucracy before the bureaucracy built the state. In ancient China, that is exactly what happened. Rice became so central that it stopped being merely food and became the physical substance of the government itself. Taxes were paid in it, officials were paid in it, soldiers were fed on it, and armies were literally measured by how much grain the state could gather, move, and store. When a Chinese dynasty wanted to project power to a distant frontier, the real question was never just how many men it could raise. It was how many bushels it could carry to keep them alive on the march. An empire's reach ended precisely where its rice ran out. So when that family in the river town could not deliver their grain, they were not just short on food. They had failed to pay the state in the one currency the state trusted most. A handful of pale seeds was the line between being a taxpayer and being conscripted property. And the grain was about to travel far beyond China, carried by monks, by traders, by conquerors, all of whom understood the same quiet truth. Whoever controlled the rice controlled the people who ate it. The clock on a much darker chapter was already ticking. The world just hadn't tasted it yet. Follow the grain west and south, and you find it doing the same thing everywhere it lands. It reshapes the ground, and then it reshapes the society standing on the ground. In the great river deltas of Southeast Asia, the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, the Chao Phraya, entire kingdoms rose on the back of it. In one medieval Cambodian empire, an immense temple city was built at the center of a staggering network of reservoirs and canals, a water machine on a scale that still stuns engineers. The stones we photograph today were paid for in rice. The priests who ran the temples were fed in rice. The whole shimmering civilization floated on a controlled flood, and when the water system finally faltered, the greatness faltered with it. The grain gave, and the grain took away. Cross into India, and rice becomes something else again. Not just food and tax, but sacred. At weddings, it is poured over the couple as a blessing, a prayer for fertility and plenty. In temple offerings across Asia, the first and purest gift laid before a god is often a bowl of cooked rice. In Japan, the emperor himself, to this day, tends a small ceremonial rice field with his own hands, planting and harvesting a token crop, a ritual that quietly insists the ruler and the grain are bound together. There was a time when Japanese lords measured their entire wealth and rank not in gold but in koku, a unit of rice, roughly the amount one person eats in a year. A warlord's power was stated as a number of koku. Samurai were paid in it. To ask how great a domain was, you asked how many people its rice could feed. The grain was the ruler. Sit with that for a moment. In the West, we grew up being told, money makes the world go round, and we picture coins and gold. But across the largest population centers on Earth, for most of recorded history, the real coin was a grain you could eat, wealth you could plant, currency that grew back, and a treasury that could be flooded, burned, or lost to a single bad monsoon. Which brings us to superstition and dogma, and to one of the strangest arguments human beings ever had over a plate of food. Because the very qualities that made rice powerful also made it feared and fought over. In some places and periods, white rice, polished rice, the pale, gleaming grain of the rich, was distrusted by the poor and moralists alike as an indulgence, food stripped of substance, a luxury that made men soft. Physicians in various eras warned that too much of it bred weakness. Meanwhile, the elite prized precisely that whiteness, that softness, that purity, and paid dearly to have the outer layers of the grain milled away. And here's the bitter joke history buried inside that vanity, the part almost nobody knew until the 20th century. Those brown outer layers they were so eager to polish off, the bran, the germ, held the very nutrient the body needs to keep its nerves working. When milling technology improved and suddenly gleaming white rice could be produced cheaply for the masses, a strange disease spread through rice-eating regions. People's legs swelled and went numb. Their hearts failed. They wasted and died, and no one could find a germ to blame. The illness had a name, beriberi, and for years the finest medical minds hunted for a poison or a microbe. They were looking for something that had been added. The truth was the opposite. It was something that had been taken away. The disease was not in the rice. It was in the polishing. A society had literally scraped the life out of its own staple food in the name of refinement, and paid for that beauty in paralysis. That is a micro-macro collision as pure as any in history. A thin brown skin, thinner than paper, milled off a single grain, and multiplied across millions of bowls. It emptied hospitals' wards and killed people who thought they were eating well. The gap between the whole grain and the polished grain was measured in human nerves. Now, every great crop in this story needs its obsessive, the stubborn, half unhinged figure who drags it somewhere it was never supposed to go. Rice has many, but let me give you one whose story sounds too neat to be true. And legend has certainly polished it, but the bones of it are real. In the American South, in the swampy lowlands around a certain colonial port, the English settlers were failing. They had land, they had heat, they had water, and they had no crop that thrived in it. And then, the story goes, a storm-battered ship limped into the harbor for repairs, a vessel that had come from the island of Madagascar. In gratitude for the help, or in trade, the captain handed over a small quantity of seed rice, a particular variety suited to exactly this kind of drowned, sweltering ground. A handful of grain, that is all it took. From that tiny seed stock, planted in the tidal muck, grew an entire plantation economy. Within a few generations, that colony was exporting rice by the millions of pounds, and the pale grain became known as Carolina gold for the fortune it printed. A single sack of seed, given away almost as an afterthought by a grateful captain, seeded one of the richest agricultural empires in the New World. But here's where you have to stop admiring the plant, because this is the exact hinge where the story turns black. The English, who grew rich on Carolina gold, did not know how to grow rice. That is not an insult. It is the fact at the center of everything that follows. Wet rice cultivation is a deep, specialized craft. Knowing when to flood and when to drain, how to build the earthen banks that hold the tide, how to thresh and winnow and pound the grain, how to keep the whole delicate water clock running for a full season. The English had none of that knowledge. But there were people who did. On the rice coast of West Africa, in the wetlands of what is now Senegal, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Africans had been growing their own species of rice for thousands of years, with all the mastery of terrace, tide, and flood that the craft demands. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The planters of the American Low Country began deliberately to seek out and buy enslaved people from exactly those rice-growing regions of Africa, because they knew, or quickly learned, that captives from the rice coast already carried the skill the planters lacked. The knowledge was in the people. So the people were hunted for the knowledge. An entire trade in human beings was tilted, at least in part, by the value of a farming technique. The Africans who were dragged across the ocean in chains were not just being stolen for their backs. They were being stolen for their minds, for a mastery of water and grain that their captors could not replicate. And then that mastery was used to build a fortune they would never share in. Picture one of them. A woman standing knee-deep in a South Carolina rice field in the wet heat of July. She knows this work in her bones. She learned it in a homeland an ocean away, in the same kind of flooded ground under a sky she can no longer see. The technique in her hands is the reason she is here at all. The reason a trader marked her out. The reason a planter paid a premium for her. She bends in water thick with mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever, diseases that made these plantations some of the deadliest ground in all of North America. The rice she is tending will make a white family in a fine harbor house extraordinarily wealthy. She will get nothing. Her children will inherit nothing but the same water. This is the part that should make you angry. The rice on the tables of Europe, the grain that graced elegant dinners and filled export ledgers, was harvested by people whose expertise had been weaponized against them. Their skill did not protect them. It condemned them, because it was the very thing that made them worth stealing. We talk about the enslaved as though they brought only labor. On the rice coast, they brought science, agricultural genius refined over millennia, and it was folded, uncredited, into somebody else's gold. That knowledge belongs to them. Their descendants along that coast, who still carry threads of that language and that cooking and that craft, still carry that story. It is theirs. It belongs to them, and it should be said out loud that the wealth was built on their brilliance and not merely their suffering. The Low Country was not the only place rice and cruelty grew from the same soil. Wherever the wet grain became a cash crop for distant markets, the pattern repeated. Enormous labor, brutal conditions, and someone far away eating clean white rice with no idea what it cost the body that grew it. But if you want the coldest chapter, the place where rice stops being merely the crop of a tragedy and becomes the instrument of one. You have to move forward in time, and you have to meet the men who kept the ledgers. Across colonial Asia, European empires ran vast rice-growing territories on a simple, chilling logic. The grain was more valuable as export than as food for the people who grew it. In good years, that was merely exploitation. In bad years, it was mass death. When drought or flood or war cut a harvest, the food did not stay to feed the hungry mouths standing right beside the fields. It kept moving, onto ships, into markets, toward profit, while the countryside that produced it starved. Again and again, in famine after famine, colonies that grew mountains of rice watched their own people die of hunger because the grain was owned by ledgers, not by need. The most infamous case came in the middle of the 20th century, in Bengal, in the final years of the Second World War. A region that had fed itself and others for centuries collapsed into a famine that killed somewhere on the order of 3 million people. 3 million. 3 million human beings, in a matter of months, in a land soaked in rice paddies. And here's the distinction you must hold on to, because it is the whole moral of the thing. The failed harvest was not enough to explain it. A cyclone, a disease in the crop, lost imports from occupied territory. Those were the natural sparks. But the scale of the dying was a human decision. Rice was diverted to feed soldiers and war workers deemed more essential. Boats that peasants needed to move food were seized and destroyed under wartime policy. Grain was pulled toward the war effort and away from the mouths of the rural poor. Nature lit the fire, policy fed it, and the men in charge left a paper trail. Wartime officials wrote of the famine struck with a contempt so open it still shocks on the page. Remarks blaming the starving for breeding too much, complaints that framed the dying as a nuisance rather than a horror. These were not private mutterings. They were set down in official correspondence, in the cold, administrative language of men who saw a catastrophe of 3 million deaths as a logistics problem, and not even a first priority one. The grain existed. The grain was even in some months in surplus in the wider region. The people died anyway, because the ledger said the rice was needed elsewhere. Think about that for a second. A land carpeted in the very crop that defines abundance, and children dying in its ditches. Not because the earth failed, but because the accounting said their lives were worth less than the grain they grew. That is the darkest thing rice has ever done, and rice did not do it. People did, and they wrote it down. Now lift your eyes, because the story does not end in the famine, and the plant that caused so much sorrow is also the plant keeping most of the world alive right now, tonight, as you listen. Here are the numbers, and they are almost impossible to hold in your head. Rice feeds more than half the human race as a daily staple. More than half. For billions of people, a day without rice is not a day without a side dish. It is a day without food. Something close to 1 out of every 5 calories consumed by all humans on the planet comes from this one grain. No other single food comes close for so many people. When you say half the world, you are not exaggerating for effect. You are underselling it. And it is grown on a scale that reshapes the planet's surface. The terraced rice fields of Asia, those staircases of water carved into mountainsides over centuries, are among the largest landscapes ever engineered by human hands, visible, some of them, from orbit. Rice paddies cover an area larger than many countries. Growing that much flooded grain uses a staggering share of all the fresh water humanity draws from the earth every year. By some estimates, around a third of it goes to irrigating this single crop. Let that land. One plant drinks roughly a third of all the irrigation water on Earth. The grain that is quietly sitting in your cupboard is one of the thirstiest things our species has ever chosen to grow. It even shapes the sky. Flooded paddies, warm and airless under the water, breathe out methane, a greenhouse gas, on such a scale that rice cultivation is a measurable factor in the planet's changing climate. The same wet fields that fed the emperors are now part of the equation of the atmosphere itself. A marshweed we tamed 9,000 years ago is now negotiating with the temperature of the whole world. And here is the wait, what? That almost nobody expects. In the 21st century, scientists worried about feeding a swelling population did something that would have seemed like sorcery to that Chinese tax official. They engineered a strain of rice to glow, in effect, with the nutrient the poor were dying without. inserting the building blocks of vitamin A into the grain itself, giving it a faint golden color and a promise. To prevent the blindness and death that afflict children in rice-dependent regions who eat little else. A grain redesigned in a laboratory to put back, in a new form, the very kind of nourishment that vain milling once scraped away. Rice has come full circle, from a plant we edited by hand in the mud to a plant we edit atom by atom in a lab, chasing the same goal our ancestors chased: get more life out of one small seed. There's even rice that survives being drowned, flood-tolerant varieties bred so that when the monsoon buries a field underwater for weeks, the crop that once would have rotted simply waits and rises again when the water falls. In a warming world of harder rains and higher tides, the grain is being taught to endure the very floods that once meant famine. The plant that demanded water is being trained to survive too much of it. But strip away the laboratories and the satellites and the climate charts, and rice is still, at its heart, exactly what it was to that family in the river town. It is still the difference between security and disaster for more people than any other food. It is still counted, hoarded, subsidized, fought over. Nations still rise and fall on the price of it. Governments still tremble when a harvest fails because a spike in the cost of rice has toppled rulers within living memory. Hungry people in the streets over the price of a bowl of grain, exactly as they were 1,000 years ago. Nothing essential has changed, only the scale. So let me take you back to that ledger and that open page and that official's brush marking a family as unable to pay. Sons about to be marched to a frontier because the grain came up short. A handful of pale seeds deciding who in that house stays free and who is dragged away. That scene is not a relic. That is the whole history of rice in a single room. A grain so humble it has almost no taste, and so powerful it is served as money, as wages, as the measure of a warlord's greatness, as the reason human beings were stolen across an ocean for the knowledge in their hands, as the difference between 3 million people living and dying in a single season. The most innocent-looking thing on your plate is one of the most consequential objects our species has ever touched. It fed us. It counted us. It paid the armies that ruled us, and it buried the ones it could not feed. Think about that the next time you tip a cup of dry white grains into a pot and barely watch them go in. You are holding a currency older than coins, a technology assembled by nameless hands over 10,000 years, a plant that carved mountains into staircases and turned swamps into empires and skill into shackles. That family in the river town lost their sons over a shortfall of it. Half the world will not eat tomorrow without it. It is not just food, it never was. You will never look at a bowl of rice the same way again. Before you go, tell me in the comments which part landed hardest for you. The enslaved rice masters of the African coast, whose stolen expertise built Carolina gold? The wartime officials who let 3 million people starve beside full paddies and wrote their contempt down in the record? Or the modern grain re-engineered in a lab to glow gold with the very nutrient our vanity once scraped away? Pick one and tell me why. If this changed the way you see the smallest thing on your dinner plate, subscribe and stay with us, because the next ordinary object we take apart is hiding a story just as big.